Hello, everyone, and welcome to this charity professional development community's 20-minute webinars. Today, we are very pleased to say that we are joined by Ruth Dwight. Ruth is a strategy and governance consultant with 20 years' experience in the charity sector, including director roles at Core and Family and Childcare and Young Citizens. Ruth is also a trustee and has an MSc in voluntary sector management with a distinction, no less, from City University. So, Ruth, I shall hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Zac, and it's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'll just quickly put my slides up. So today's session is all about what governance is and why it's important, and it can feel sometimes like a bit of a dry subject. So what I want to explain to you today and talk to you a bit about is what it is, what it isn't, and what kind of a difference it can make, and what kind of and provide you with some tips, some top tips about how to make it really work for your organisation. So that's what we're going to do by the end of this session. But just to start with, a little bit of a definition about what it is, and it sort of depends on what kind of organisation you are working in. So a kind of corporate definition might say something like governance is a framework for managing organisations. It'll identify who can make decisions, who has the authority to act on behalf of the organisation, and who's accountable for how an organisation might behave and perform. But that's quite corporate in its nature. So how does that apply to the charity sector? Well, actually, it can be more about how an organisation is being led and the direction it's aiming to, and getting everyone on the same bus, getting that kind of clarity of direction, giving people ensuring that the vision of what the organisation wants to achieve is shared, and being able to manage that organisation, oversee that organisation in broad terms, and that's really a really important point, that kind of broad terms. So it's useful, I think, to see governance with sort of three cornerstones, and those three being around resources, around the money, often the bit where a lot of boards spend their time in meetings, looking at accounts, looking at budgets, etc., critiquing how much money is being spent or how much money is being brought in. But additionally, it's really important that trustees and that governance also looks at strategy, at what it is that an organisation is aiming to do and how it's going to get there. So thinking about how a board might think more about that, considering potentially taking a big issue, a sort of big ticket item that an organisation's trying to achieve, and looking at that within a board meeting, putting that onto the agenda, giving space to talk about strategy and giving space to assess and monitor how an organisation is achieving according to its strategic goals. And thirdly, really, really important to be considering, are we actually doing what we're aiming to do? What kind of impact are we actually having on our beneficiaries, on the people that we really want to make a difference to? So it's a useful question really to think, where does your board focus its time, whether you're a trustee, whether you're someone working within an organisation, and if it's mainly on the money, which obviously is really critical, particularly at the moment, then is there space? How can you make space for trustees, for the board to think more about how it intends to achieve its goals and whether it's actually making the impact that it wants to achieve? So governance can often be confused with management. The lines in between are quite grey, can be quite blurry. So I wanted to give a little bit of clarity between the two. This is a really useful distinction, I think, comes from Mike Hudson, who writes a great book called Managing Without Profit. And really the sort of differences that you want to consider, the fact that governance we should really be thinking about the board doing that, and management should be things that the staff are doing. Of course, in lots of different organisations of lots of different sizes, it's not as simple as that. In some organisations there might not be any staff, or there might only be a couple of staff, and so often the board have to get a little bit more involved. Sometimes there are people on the board who have great amounts of expertise, so they might be able, in a really good position to be able to support at a more operational level. But really important to think, whatever roles you have to play, if you have to put both hats on, that you know at the time what hat you're wearing, and therefore what your goal should be, what your kind of drivers should be. So going through this, it's really important that there is a mission and a strategy within an organisation. So board's responsibility to determine that and agree that and set it, and then to delegate that onto the staff to be able to continue to develop it and implement it. So that's quite a nice clear one. In terms of the values of the organisation, it's actually really important that the board and the staff are behaving in a way that is according to their values. Quite often that's something that is stuck within the staff, so important that board are involved in establishing those and setting those, but that they uphold them as well. Within stakeholders, it's really important that management are communicating with the stakeholders, but the board might come out to represent the organisation. The board might also be representative of the stakeholders within the organisation. Within the resources that an organisation will need, the management are going to be raising those, but it's within the board's responsibility to ensure that the organisation continues to be viable, continues to be a going concern. So there's a good balance to strike there. Performance, so really important that the board are able to monitor the performance. What is it that you're monitoring as a board? Are you trying to monitor both the finances, but also, as we were talking about before, progress towards the strategy and the impact that an organisation's having? And then obviously staff's responsibility to monitor it, but also to be the ones that are delivering and measuring and reporting. Decision making. So board are going to be making those decisions, maybe resolving any conflicts that they might have. But the staff are going to be needed to present options, and then once decisions are made, to take action on those decisions. In terms of the governance process, staff are going to be supporting that, but really the board's responsibility to be managing it. For staff appointments, anything below the CEO really should be being done by the staff. There might be a trustee sitting on the board or a panel of a senior leadership appointment, for example, but really board's responsibility to appoint and develop and appraise the chief exec, but leaving the rest to staff, usually. Again, bit of a blurry line depending on the nature of the organisation. For risk management and legal compliance things, you've got staff there to make sure that the organisation is compliant, but obviously the responsibility ultimately sits with the board, and then that's going to be a really important thing for trustees to remember the sort of levels of responsibilities they have and how to limit any liability, reduce any liabilities that they might have. And lastly, and I'll talk about this a few times today, that the relationship is just hugely important between the board and the staff. I put these two little cogs here because really the two have to work together in order for the organisation to thrive. So you might have the board providing their insight and their wisdom, being able to take that slightly removed and slightly critical view on things, whereas staff, be important that they're able to provide the information, put forward their suggestions and their advice because they're obviously close to the action or delivering the services, and providing that kind of support to the board if needed. So yeah, as I say, best when really the two organisations are the two groups, the two bodies are working closely together. But really it's a balancing act. So the two need to both be strong in order for this to work. If you've got a strong board and weak staff, the board is going to feel like it needs to intervene into the detail. If you've got the other way around and you've got a really strong staff and a weak board, there could be some quite long-term risks. Management are less likely to be held accountable. Staff might be taking on duties that should be carried out by the board, or if they don't, then it could be putting the organisation at risk because they're not necessarily being challenged or having enough rigorous enough decision-making processes. Likewise, if you've got both weak, then obviously that's not a good place to be. Neither group's going to be able to solve issues. You'd be sort of going down in a bit of a downward spiral, because then what happens is the reputation of the organisation declines. It becomes harder to attract effective staff and board members. The services then deteriorate. You've not got good people being able to. It's a sad story, not a good story there. So you want to be able to prevent that, or if you're there already, the organisation really needs to be rebuilt, and that's where sometimes organisations might bring in an interim CEO or an interim chair, for example, who might have that kind of specific turnaround experience to be able to support that charity to get back up on its feet. But the ideal, obviously, is to have a strong board and a strong staff team. So how do you get that strong board? Well, there are some things that you have to do as a charity. So if you are a registered charity, you are accountable as an organisation to the Charity Commission. Some charities are also incorporated. For some, that might mean that they're also registered with Companies House. For some, they might be CIOs, in which case they wouldn't be registered with Companies House. They'd just be registered with the Charity Commission. But important to make sure that if you're a trustee or even a staff member, you know what kind of charity makeup, what your legal structure is. You know who you need to be reporting to, who you're accountable to. Charity Commission has a lot of guidance, so it has the Charities Act, which is a kind of the legal duties for charities compliance, and then it also has this document called CC3, very catchy title for it. But what they have done is produce this quite nice infographic and summary of the duties of a trustee, of what you need to know and what you need to do. Every trustee should receive a copy of this and make sure they've read it and understood it. It is being written and produced in a much more accessible way now, but that's really, really important. So there's a whole load of things you have to do. Then there's also a whole load of things that can make governance that much more effective. So beyond the duties, how can you make sure that the governance of organisation, which can clearly make a massive difference to the efficiency and the effectiveness and the sustainability and impact that a charity can have, how do you go about doing that? So about 10 or so years ago, about 5 or so years ago now, the Charity Governance Code was produced, and that was created by a cross-sector working group with observation from the Charity Commission. So it's not been developed by the Charity Commission, but by various organisations like NCVO, for example. And what it provides you is the sort of imagining that the governance is the house. So you need a good, strong foundation. You need to understand what the role is of your trustee and the context within which your charity is working. And it needs a roof on its house. And the roof is really about what your organisation is trying to do, what it's trying to achieve, what direction it's going in, where it's trying to get to. And then the pillars that are holding that all up and giving you the structure of the house are all these things within here. Each of these in the code, which is all available online, is broken down into the sort of the goal of what you're trying to achieve by good practice here, or by excellent practice, and also a series of best practice guidance, basically, that you can assess yourself, your organisation, against. It's split into two, so there's guidance for large organisations that are over $1 million a year, and for smaller organisations that are under that. For some very small organisations, particularly where there's no staff, that guidance is almost too much really still for those organisations. So there has been some guidance now produced for micro organisations as well, which is really helpful. But it really describes what you could be striving towards. This is not a sort of definitive statement of everybody should be doing absolutely everything in here, and if you're not, it's a disaster. It's much more about these are the things that you can strive towards. So there are lots of ways in which you can assess your organisation against these. You can just do it yourselves by scoring. It's a bit of a laborious exercise doing it that way. There are a couple of organisations who've designed surveys and questionnaires so that you can use it like a checklist and score. If every individual trustee does that, then it can be a really useful way to see a summary and say, well, where do we think we stand? How do we think we're doing around board effectiveness? And what are some of the areas where we think we could improve? So NCVO, for example, has a governance wheel where you can each assess and give yourself a score. It asks you a series of questions. The Directory of Social Change, or the DSC, has developed a governance app which is free, that a straightforward way of being able to do a self-assessment. There's a tool, a digital tool called Digiboard, of which I'm a sort of registered practitioner. You can either do it yourself or you can have an external consultant who can come in and support you to do that. The governance code does suggest that about every 3 years you should have an external review of your governance, and that should be the case whether you feel like you're in a really good position or not, because there's always places to improve, and it's an opportunity for everyone to be able to speak to somebody who's a bit more objective and get that kind of objective view of how the organisation's going. So there's lots of potential in that, and a really useful thing to do. And just lastly, I wanted to give you some top tips really of the organisations that I've worked with, and some of the things that I think come up quite a lot that can be really, really useful to improve your governance. So firstly, to have really clear roles. Everybody knows what they're doing. You have roles descriptions, you can have terms of reference for subcommittees, a scheme of delegation so you know who's going to be doing what. That you have a really diverse board, so you're moving away from any kind of group think that you might have. If an organisation's been founded by a particular person, they've brought in their kind of friends and family, is it time to bring in expertise from other sectors, bring in voices from people with lived experience, for example. Recruit openly, so get support to do that from agencies, promote it outside your circles, outside of your sector. And think about, once you are recruiting those people, how your board behaves to include everybody, to make sure that everything is accessible, how your reports are produced, how meetings take place, what kind of support you might be providing for new trustees. Can you buddy them up, for example? It's an obvious one, but that you follow your constitution. Lots of people haven't read it or haven't seen it for a long time, but make sure you familiarise yourself with it, ensure it's up to date. Appreciate that you can change it. You have to go through the Charity Commission usually, but it is changeable, so it is possible to modernise it if it needs to, or change it according to the way your organisation now works. Managing risks. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but making sure you've got a risk register. There are templates available to help get that set up. And maybe even make sure that that's a living document. So maybe even take one of the highest risks at each board meeting and discuss it. Just bring it to the team. When you are bringing things to board meetings or sharing information, make sure you know as a trustee, or as a staff member, what information it is that's needed, making sure it's relevant. You're not just providing reports for the sake of it that nobody ever reads, or that people spend hours and hours developing. Keep it concise, keep it clear, connect it to the strategy that you have as an organisation, so the board can do their job easily of knowing whether you're on track or where things have gone off track or what's not working and what you can do about that. And make sure those reports are really accessible. Decision making, so really big thing that boards have to do, and that is huge part of governance. So make sure that there's a clear process for it. Everybody knows who's responsible for making those decisions. Crucially, I think the last two are probably my biggest ones. I think relationships, as I said, is the absolute key thing. Between the CEO and chair, it's absolutely essential. That is one of the most important relationships. Lots of really good advice and support on that from the Association of Chairs. I'd really recommend that. But also between the board and senior staff members. So much of good governance is about good, positive, effective relationships. And lastly, this is part of all of that, but keep learning. There is, there's no position you ever get to within an organisation where there's an excuse that you know everything. So I think keep learning and keep finding out what people might need to know, what people might need to know more about. So finally, I'd say there's lots in here. It can feel a bit daunting, but the reassuring thing always is that the Charity Commission understands that trustees are volunteers. And so, as long as trustees are being honest and reasonable and doing the best that they can do, then they are usually protected. So that's always a nice reassuring point to end with. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that, Ruth. I think it's really useful to have that delineation between the board and the staff, but to also, I love the simple cog image just to show that it is collaborative. And then with the good governance code, it's collaborative under the purpose of the charity, which I think is, fantastic. Thanks for giving us some places to go and find areas to review our governance, and for giving us some top tips. And obviously I'm completely biased, but ending on the top tip of continuously developing, I promise I didn't tell Ruth to do that. That was all by herself. So thank you very much. So for anyone who enjoyed this, then please do give us a like and subscribe. Got to get those plugs in there anywhere I can. But Ruth, do you want to end with a final thought to close us out?
Yeah, I think I'd go back to what I said at the beginning, really, which is that governance is often seen as a bit of a sort of dry topic, but actually I think it's absolutely fascinating. As I say, I think it's all about relationships and about how organisations behave, and it can have such a huge impact on the difference that a charity can have for its beneficiaries. So definitely not one to be overlooked, and I think actually huge potential for it to make a massive difference.
Agreed. What a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much, and we will see everyone next time.